Today we got some more actual history about the Indian Wars just west of the Alleghenies during and just after the United States Revolution. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life, published by Jospeh Pritts all the way back in 1838. In this episode, we will read two short incidents of border life that occurred in western Pennsylvania. The first is the tragic story of two twin daughters of Frederick Mannheim, Maria and Christina, 16 years of age, who were captured along with their father in October of 1779. The second is the story of the capture of Massie Herbison and her children, who were taken away from their home near Pittsburgh in May of 1792. This was during the Northwest Indian War not long after St. Clair's terrible defeat, which wiped out much of the United States Army. Mrs. Herbison's husband was away as a scout, and though some of the soldiers had boarded in her home the night before, they would leave her and her family unprotected on the morning of May 22nd, 1792. So here is the story of Maria and Christina Manheim, followed by the story of Massie Herbison and her children. An affecting history of the dreadful distresses of Frederick Mannheim's family. Frederick Mannheim, an industrious German with his family, consisting of his wife, Catherine, a daughter of 18 years of age, and Maria and Christina, his youngest children, twins, about 16, resided near the river Mohawk, 8 miles west of Johnston. On the 19th of October, 1779, the father being at work some distance from his habitation, and the mother and eldest daughter on a visit at a neighbor's, two hostile Canassadega Indians rushed in and captured the twin sisters. The party to which these Indians belonged consisted of 50 warriors, who, after securing 23 of the inhabitants of that neighborhood, among whom was the unfortunate Frederick Mannheim, and firing their houses, retired for 4 days with the utmost precipitancy, till they were quite safe from pursuit. The place where they halted on the evening of the day of rest was a thick pine swamp, which rendered the darkness of an uncommonly gloomy night still more dreadful. The Indians kindled a fire which they had not done before, and ordered their prisoners whom they kept together to refresh themselves with such provisions as they had. The Indians ate by themselves. Instead of retiring to rest after supping, the appalled captives observed their enemies buried in operations which boded nothing good. 2 saplings were pruned clear of branches up to the very top, and all the brush cleared away for several rods around them. While this was doing, others were splitting pitch pine billets into small splinters above 5 inches in length, and as small as one's little finger, sharpening one end and dipping the other in melted turpentine. At length, with countenances distorted by internal fury, and with hideous yells, the 2 savages who had captured the hapless Maria and Christina leaped into the midst of their circle, and dragged those ill-fated maidens shrieking from the embraces of their companions. These warriors had disagreed about whose property these girls should be, as they had jointly seized them, and to terminate the dispute agreeably to the abominable usage of the savages, it was determined by the chiefs of the party that the prisoners, who gave rise to the contention, should be destroyed, and that their captors should be the principal agents in this execrable business. These furies, assisted by their comrades, stripped the forlorn girls, already convulsed with apprehensions, and tied each to a sapling, with their hands as high extended above their heads as possible, and then pitched them from their knees to their shoulders, with upwards of 600 of the sharpened splinters above described, which at every puncture were attended with screams of distress, that echoed and re-echoed through the wilderness. And then, to complete the infernal tragedy, the splinters, all standing erect on the bleeding victims, were every one set on fire, and exhibited a scene of monstrous misery, beyond the power of speech to describe, or even the imagination to conceive. It was not until 3 hours had elapsed from the commencement of their torments, and they had lost almost every resemblance of the human form, that these hapless virgins sunk into the arms of their deliverer, Death. So that is the end of this very tragic story of the death of the 2 twin daughters of Frederick Mannheim. I have not been able to find any information about Frederick Mannheim or the other captives outside of this book by Jospeh Pritts. My guess is that the rest of the captives were eventually returned, or else their deaths would have been told of in this book. and only these 2 girls were put to death because the Indians who captured them were arguing over whose wife they would be. But it is unclear exactly what happened to Frederick Mannheim and the rest of the captives. This next story about Massie Herbison is also fairly grim, but less so, as it is about both her capture and her heroic escape from the Indians in 1792. An account of the sufferings of Massie Herbison and her family, who were taken prisoners by a party of Indians, given on oath before John Wilkins, Esquire, one of the justices of the peace for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Massie Herbison, on her oath according to law, being taken before John Wilkins, Esquire, one of the Commonwealth's justices of the peace in and for the county of Allegheny, deposeth and saith that on the 22nd day of this instant she was taken from her own house, within 200 yards of Reed's blockhouse, which is called 25 miles from Pittsburgh. Her husband, being one of the spies, was from home. 2 of the scouts had lodged with her that night, but had left her house about sunrise, in order to go to the blockhouse, and had left the door standing wide open. Shortly after the 2 scouts went away, a number of Indians came into the house and drew her out of bed by the feet. The 2 eldest children, who also lay in another bed, were drawn out in the same manner. A younger child, about 1 year old, slept with Mrs. Herbison. The Indians then scrambled about the articles in the house. Whilst they were at this work, Mrs. Herbison went out of the house and hallooed to the people in the blockhouse. One of the Indians then ran up and stopped her mouth. Another ran up with his tomahawk drawn, and a third ran and seized the tomahawk and called her his squaw. This last Indian claimed her as his, and continued by her. About 15 of the Indians then ran down toward the blockhouse and fired their guns at the block and storehouse, in consequence of which 1 soldier was killed and another wounded, one having been at the spring and the other having come or looking out of the storehouse. Mrs. Herbison telling the Indians that there were about 40 men in the blockhouse and each man had 2 guns. The Indians went to them who were firing at the blockhouse and brought them back. They then began to drive Mrs. Herbison and her children away, but a boy about 3 years old being unwilling to leave the house, they took him by the heels and dashed him against the house, then stabbed and scalped him. They then took Mrs. Herbison and the 2 other children up to the top of the hill, where they stopped until they tied up the plunder they had got. While they were busy about this, Mrs. Herbison counted them, and the number amounted to 32, including 2 white men that were with them, painted like Indians. That several of the Indians could speak English, and that she knew 3 or 4 of them very well, having often seen them go up and down the Allegheny River. 2 of them she knew to be Senecas and 2 Muncies, who had gotten their guns mended by her husband about 2 years ago. She knew that they sent 2 Indians with her, and the others took their course towards Puckty. She and her children, along with the 2 Indians, had not gone above 200 yards when the Indians caught 2 of her uncle's horses, put her and the youngest child on one, and one of the Indians and the other child on the other. The Indians then took her and her children to the Allegheny River, and took them over in bark canoes, as they could not get the horses to swim the river. After they had crossed the river, the oldest child, a boy of about 5 years of age, began to mourn for his brother, when one of the Indians tomahawked and scalped him. They then traveled all day very hard, and that night arrived at a large camp, covered with bark, which by appearance might hold 50 men. That night they took her about 300 yards from the camp, into a large bottom, bound her arms, gave her some bedclothes, and laid down one on each side of her. That next morning they took her into a thicket on the hillside, and one remained with her till the middle of the day, while the other went to watch the path, lest some white people should follow them. They then exchanged places during the remainder of the day. She got a piece of dried venison about the bulk of an egg that day, and a piece about the same size the day they were marching. That evening, Wednesday the 23rd, they moved her to a new place, and secured her as the night before. During the day of the 23rd, she made several attempts to get the Indian's gun or tomahawk, and had she succeeded, she would have put him to death. She was nearly detected in trying to get the tomahawk. The next morning, Thursday, one of the Indians went out as on the day before to watch the path. The other lay down and fell asleep. When she found that he was sleeping, she stole her short gown, handkerchief, a child's frock, and then made her escape. The sun was about half an hour high when she took her course from the Allegheny, in order to deceive the Indians, as they would naturally pursue her that way. That day she traveled along Conquenessing Creek. The next day she altered her course, and, as she believes, fell upon the waters of Pine Creek, which empties into the Allegheny. Thinking that this was not her best course, she took over some dividing ridges, lay on a dividing ridge on Friday night, and on Saturday came to Squaw Run, continued down the run until an Indian or some other person shot a deer. She saw the person about 150 yards from her, the deer running and the dog pursuing it, which from the appearance she supposed to be an Indian dog. She then altered her course, but again came to the same run, and continued down it until she got so tired that she was obliged to lie down, it having rained on her all that day and the night before. She lay there that night, and it rained constantly. On Sunday morning she proceeded down the run until she came to the Allegheny River, and continued down the river till she came to the opposite of Carter's house, on the inhabited side, where she made a noise, and James Closier brought her over the river to Carter's house. This was sworn to me at Pittsburgh on the 28th day of May, 1792. John Wilkins. So that's it for this episode, which is another special edition for Patreon and YouTube channel members. Fortunately, Massie Herbison was able to escape just a few days after she was captured. She was captured on the 22nd of May, and she gave this deposition about her escape on the 28th, only 6 days later. Although there isn't much else documented on the story of Frederick Mannheim and his family that we read first, there is more information out there about the life of Massie Herbison. She is called Massie Herbison in Incidents of Border Life, but other sources list her name as Massy Harbison or Massy Harbison. This story did not mention it, but she was carrying her infant with her the whole time during her escape, and the baby survived. Mrs. Harbison would live until 1837, and 1 year before her death she published a much longer account of her captivity, titled A Narrative of the Sufferings of Massie Harbison from Indian Barbarity, giving an account of her captivity, the murder of her 2 children, her escape with an infant at her breast. We will be doing some episodes from this book in the future on our regular YouTube channel, which should provide a much more detailed account of Mrs. Harbison's terrible ordeal, as well as her heroic escape. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV, and because we talk about people from the past who lived much harder lives than we have to today, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. Many thanks to our Patreon and YouTube channel members for your continued support of the mission of this channel. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.